Welcome to the section on climate resilience. Let's start by considering what resilience means. What does this word mean to you? And what does resilience mean in relation to climate change? Countries around the world are developing strategies to increase their resilience to deal with the effect of climate change and all the related environmental issues that go along with it. These strategies involve two approaches: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation involves things we can do to slow or stop climate change. This involves efforts to reduce or prevent emissions of greenhouse gases. So shifting to renewable energies, making older equipment more energy efficient, or changing management practices or behaviour in people. Climate adaptation or resilience is what we do to deal with the impact of climate change that's already happening or coming in the future. Adaptation strategies will be different in each context, although we can learn a lot from each other. Resilience measures could include forestry or reforestation projects, selecting drought-resistant crops, rainwater harvesting projects, restoration of floodplains to absorb floodwater, conservation of mangroves to help with sea encroachment, making more public transport available, and behaviour change. As we've discussed before, developing countries have the least responsibility for climate change, but face the need to make the greatest adaptations. Despite being responsible for only 3% of all emissions since the Industrial Revolution, the continent of Africa is facing the most immediate and dire consequences of climate change and the greatest need for resilience and adaptation. In Kenya, we can find inspirational examples of climate resilience, as well as examples of how unequally the impact of climate change is being felt. Those impacts and deforestation were already in evidence when Professor Wangari Maathai was prompted to set up the Kenyan Greenbelt movement in 1997. Women in rural areas were reporting that streams were drying up, their food supply was less secure, and that they were having to walk further and further to get firewood, for fuel, for animal feed, and for fencing. The Greenbelt movement encouraged and trained women and community groups to work together to grow seedlings, to plant trees, to bind the soil, to store rainwater, and to provide food and firewood. Since it was established, 30,000 women have been trained in the programme, and over 51 million trees have been planted. It's an incredible example of climate resilience. However, as climate change speeds up, the overall challenges are worsening. In Kenya, it is estimated that around 4.4 million people, that's 27% of the arid and semi-arid lands population, are facing high levels of acute food insecurity. Therefore, the Kenyan government had no choice but to divert money towards supporting communities to become more climate resilient, to stay alive, basically. This money had to be diverted from other sources, such as education, thus resulting in fewer children being able to go to school. This is one example of how climate injustice hampers the development of countries in the global south, as they must overcome more of these kinds of obstacles. Faced with the cost of climate adaptation, governments are pushed to borrow to address the needs of their people. Kenyan government debt is high and rising each year, as you can see in the graph. The government has borrowed to provide water and sanitation infrastructure, for example, which is of extreme importance in Kenya and to us all. Developing countries also face high interest rates, and the World Bank also adds conditions to loans that many argue actually make the underlying problems worse. So what can be done to address this? There will be more about solutions later in the module, but for now we can discuss the movement to address what the UN refers to as loss and damage. Loss and damage refers to the negative consequences that arise from the unavoidable risks of climate change, like rising sea levels, prolonged heat waves, desertification, the acidification of the sea, and extreme events like bushfires and crop failures. As the climate crisis unfolds, these events will happen more and more frequently, and the consequences will become more and more severe, and so the need for action is more urgent. In 2022, the issue of loss and damage was put on the agenda in global climate talks, acknowledging that countries and communities in the developing world need and deserve funds to boost resilience and adaptation measures to deal with the impacts of climate change. In the picture, you can see Cork School student and climate activist Sumaya Mohammed, who attended the COP27 talks in Egypt where these issues were raised. It's estimated that loss and damage financing needs in developing countries could reach up to $580 billion by 2030 and will rise substantially unless action is taken now. Another estimate suggests that sub-Saharan African countries will have to take on almost $1 trillion in debt over the next 10 years unless the necessary and long-promised finance is delivered. So far, the United States and the EU resist the idea of taking responsibility for loss and damage. In Copenhagen in 2009, and again at climate talks in Paris in 2015, $100 billion was promised per year by wealthy countries to support climate resilience in developing countries. But by 2023, this target has still not been met, and some estimates say that less than a third of the reported contributions have materialised. Ireland currently contributes €100 million per year, but Trócaire and Christian Aid estimate this to be just 1/5 of our fair share, and they call on the Irish government to lead by example by meeting our targets. It's clear that funding for climate resilience is another climate justice issue. As Trócaire puts it, the climate crisis is a crisis of inequality and its scale is staggering.